Hi, welcome back to Detective and Mystery Fiction. If you enjoy my content, please consider hitting the like button. It's the only way the YouTube algorithm notices me. This is the first collection of the August 1922 issue of The Black Mask. It features 4 short stories. I've added timestamp for each story in the video description. Hope you enjoy this one. The Failure by Harold Ward. Amos Duncan paused for a second beside the time clock in the hallway just outside the offices of Carney and Kirk. Then, his heart beating like a trip hammer, he mustered up courage enough to push open the swinging doors and peep into the gloomy interior. He was frightened, scared to the point of hysteria. Yet for 30 years he had stopped in that selfsame place in the hallway morning and noon on his way to work. For 30 years, 52 weeks in the year, 6 days a week and twice each day, had he sought his number on the time clock and pushed the button which registered his comings and his departures. Instinctively, for figures were one of his hobbies, he made the calculation in his head. 18,720 times had he pushed his way through those doors. And never before, except possibly the first time when he had applied for a place with the firm, had he been as frightened as he was now. For this was the first time he had ever come to rob. Getting a grip on himself, he entered the big office on tiptoe, an office covering nearly 1/4 of a city block. Yet, he knew that old Bill Judkins, the watchman, would be making his rounds out in the factory at that particular hour. It was a part of his daily work to check up the dial on the night watchman's clock. He knew that the old man traveled as true to schedule as a mail train. He halted just inside the doors and listened, his eyes taking in every one of the familiar details. From where he stood, he could discern the dark shapes of row after row of desks, each identical in size and finish with its mates. Around 2 sides of the big room were innumerable cubby holes of offices divided from each other by ground glass partitions, extending 2/3 of the way to the ceiling. During working hours, they housed the elite of the office world, the men and women who had pushed their heads above those of their fellows. His own desk was second from the front in the second row from the right, just inside the cashier's cage, a huge affair of wire netting and glass. It gave him renewed courage for the task ahead as he gazed upon its outlines staring at him out of the darkness. For 27 years, since the day of his promotion from the office boy ranks, he had occupied that desk, or one like it, in Carney and Kirk's office, giving to Carney and Kirk the best of his manhood for starvation wages and 2 weeks vacation, yearly on pay. Others had gone over his head, scores of them, men no better fitted than he, young cubs with pull or a college education. He had long since given up hopes of promotion. He had reached the point where he was a mere cog in the machine, a fizzle and a failure. In 99 cases out of every 100 when a man goes wrong, a woman is responsible. In Amos Duncan's case, the woman was Mrs. Amos Duncan. A downtrodden cog in an office machine, a man with little force of character in the beginning, henpecked at home and abroad, Duncan held to the firm opinion that his wife had conferred a favor upon him by marrying him. The fact that he had rescued her from a life of drudgery in the shipping room of the factory changed his opinion not one iota. Nor did Mrs. Duncan fail to keep his memory refreshed whenever opportunity offered itself. Amos Duncan longed to appear as a hero in the eyes of his wife. It had taken him 2 years to screw up his courage to the point of robbing Carney and Kirk. Yet he had planned the affair so often that he knew he would be absolutely above suspicion. And with the money once in his hands, he could hide it until all memory of the affair had blown over, and then, with a carefully concocted story of a lucky speculation on change, resign and migrate to some distant city to spend his declining years in ease with the lady who had assumed his name. Carney and Kirk always paid off in cash. Duncan knew that there was close to $50,000 in the vault ready to go into the pay envelopes in the morning. As assistant cashier, and one of the old-timers with the firm, he had been entrusted with the combination. He had read that skilled burglars are able to open vaults by listening to the whirl of the mechanism. A rag saturated with alcohol would do away with telltale fingerprints. The police would think the robbery the work of a professional. Still walking on his toes, he worked his way through the maze of desks to the big vault in the rear of the office behind the cashier's cage. Taking a tiny flashlight from his pocket, he pressed the button and allowed the stream of light to play over the dial, while he manipulated the affair with fingers that trembled as from the ague. It refused to work. In his nervousness, he had gone past the number. He took a deep breath and, with the sweat standing out in great beads upon his face, attacked the job again. Someone was entering the office through one of the rear doors leading from the factory. He stopped for a second. Then, as he heard the footsteps coming toward him in the darkness, he leaped outside the cage and drew his revolver. He had never fired a gun in his life. He had bought this one, a cheap, second-hand affair, merely as a matter of precaution and because he knew that burglars always carried such weapons. From out of the darkness came a flash, a report. A bullet sped past his head and flattened itself against the vault door. It must be that Judkins, the faithful, had heard something suspicious and had entered. He longed to call out to the watchman his name. The realization of his mission in the office at that time of the night stopped him. Involuntarily, he gave a little squeak of fear. A second bullet passed unpleasantly near. Instinctively, just as a cornered rat will fight, his finger pressed the trigger of his own gun. He fired aimlessly in the general direction of the other, dodging from desk to desk, knocking over chairs. He was in a panic of fear. The other's fire ceased suddenly. From out of the darkness across the great room came a dull, throaty cry. Something metallic jangled against the tiled floor. An instant later, it was followed by a heavier body, a body that crashed against a desk as it dropped. Duncan leaped through the folding doors and out into the hallway again. To unlock the outer door and dash out onto the sidewalk was but the work of an instant. Around the corner, he heard the shrill whistle of the policeman on the beat as, attracted by the shots, he came lumbering along, signaling for his mate. He dodged into the shadow and turned into the alley. Behind him, he could hear the policeman hammering on the office door with his nightstick. From 2 blocks down the street came the sound of another whistle. In the distance, a third shrilled, proving that reinforcements were on the way. Mrs. Duncan was sleeping soundly when he arrived home after a roundabout trip through alleys and side streets. Letting himself into the house with his pass key, he hastily sought the security of his own room. So far as he knew, no one had seen him either going to the factory nor leaving it. But God, what a fizzle he had made of the affair. And there was blood on his hands, the blood of poor old Judkins. What had he gained? Nothing, absolutely nothing. He paced the floor, every nerve tingling. He wondered, poor old Judkins. And he had a crippled wife too. With Judkins gone, she would have to go to the poorhouse. It was something that he had not foreseen. He was still pacing the floor when the sun came up in the east. In the other room, he heard Mrs. Duncan getting up. In less than 2 hours he would have to go to the office. Of course, no one would suspect him, but he could hear Mrs. Duncan rattling the pots and pans in the kitchen when the doorbell rang. He opened the bedroom door a crack and peeped through as she answered the summons. A gruff voice was asking for him. He heard her admit the visitors. There seemed to be 2 of them. Then she called shrilly up the stairway for him. He knew that they were detectives from their heavy tread. They were after him for killing Judkins. His brain was in a whirl. Yet he wondered how it happened that they associated him with the crime. He had been so careful too. Probably he had dropped something in his mad rush to the outer door. He could never face the music. And Mrs. Duncan? What would she say? He couldn't tell her that he had gone to the office to rob the vault for her sake and had made a failure. The gun lay in the bureau drawer where he had tossed it. He picked it up and broke it open. The chambers were all empty. He had used every cartridge in killing poor old Judkins. From downstairs came a buzz of conversation. Mrs. Duncan shrieked. He heard his own name mentioned. God! They had told her what he had done. He must move rapidly. His glance fell upon a bottle of carbolic acid. Mrs. Duncan was at the bottom of the stairway now, shrieking his name. He placed the bottle to his mouth and emptied it at a gulp. With the fiery liquid eating into his vitals, his throat afire, he reeled across the room and tumbled in a heap upon the bed. Outside, Mrs. Duncan was pounding at his door. "Amos, wake up!" She was shouting between sobs, for Mrs. Duncan was a hysterical woman, and awful things happened. "There are 2 detectives here. Old man Judkins went home sick from the factory last night, and while he was gone, somebody broke into the office. The robbers had a fight, 'cause one of them was found dead when the police broke in after hearing the shots. Enright, the cashier, is out of town, and they want you to come down and open the vault and see if anything is gone. Oh, isn't it awful? Amos, why don't you answer?" End of The Failure by Harold Ward. The Weight of a Feather by Clausen. The state had completed its case. The conviction of the prisoner seemed certain, in spite of the fact that the evidence was purely circumstantial. The attorney for the state was gathering up his papers at his table, upon which, facing the jury, stood a massive bronze bust of Beethoven, the composer. Beside the bust lay a cowboy's lariat. Nothing else. The attorney was a square-jawed, deep-chested man with coal blue eyes set much too wide apart, and a bristling grey pompadour brushed back from his massive, corrugated forehead. He had handled the case well. It had been a difficult one. The method alleged to have been used by the murderer savoured of dime novels. The appearance of the prisoner, too, had been hard to overcome. The attorney admitted grudgingly, as he let his cold, hard eyes rest for a fraction of a moment upon the boy sitting erect on the bench beside the girl, with his head thrown back, that it was hard to believe him guilty of a cunning, brutal murder, and harder to convince a jury that he had committed it. The lad raised his eyes for an instant to the face of his accuser just then, but there was no look of malice in them. He seemed merely to be endeavouring to fathom the reason for the vindictiveness that had just been directed against himself by this man, whom he had known since boyhood. He was not the conventional, beetle-browed murder suspect. Indeed, he was the one person in the crowded courtroom who seemed out of place there. He was a little above average height. The dark head of the girl seated on the bench beside him came just above his shoulders, and slender, not slight, but slender, with the vigorous slenderness of youth. His eyes were blue, large and very clear, and his hair was crisp and sandy from habitual exposure to the elements. It was early afternoon. A hush lay over the crowded courtroom following the closing announcement of the attorney for the state. It was the courtroom of a small western city at the foot of the snow-clad Sierra Nevadas. A ray of the wan winter sun entering through the grimy window lay upon the judge's silvery hair. The judge raised his watery eyes and glanced out at the snow-covered courthouse square, where a gang of men with shovels were making a path for himself and his court to walk home upon. It had been snowing steadily all morning. During the pause in the proceedings, the constable left his post at the door to replenish the fire in the stove. He was a young man and big, a typical western small-town constable, broad-shouldered and ruddy-faced. His uniform was painfully new. He moved with clumsy momentousness on tiptoe across the floor, opened the door of the stove, and placed 2 pine knots upon the bright embers with slow deliberation, as if to invest this simple act with some of the importance he felt. Then he closed the door of the stove softly and started back on tiptoe to his post. As he passed the table of the defendant's counsel, the lawyer looked up and said to him, "Take the stand, Ed, please." The constable glanced at the prosecuting attorney as if for permission. Then he mounted the steps of the witness box slowly, and upon being sworn in by the clerk, sat down. For several minutes he remained in his seat without movement, his elbows on the arm of the chair, and his stubbled chin resting in the hollow of his great hairy paw, waiting for the attorney for the defense to begin. All eyes were turned upon the prisoner's counsel, seated at his table near the accused and the girl, slightly in advance of them. The attorney was a heavy, ponderous-looking man. His face, the color of putty, was full and shaven smoothly. His eyes were large and china blue, and his coarse hair lay plastered untidily about his temples. His garments were obtrusively comfortable. His coat fitted him like a sack hung over a gatepost, and his trousers bagged scandalously at the knees. The short, stubby fingers of his right hand rested on the edge of the table. His attitude was serene and unruffled. He did not seem in the least disconcerted with the task before him, the task of discrediting the avalanche of circumstantial evidence that had piled itself upon his client. He sat relaxed in his chair, looking at the constable on the witness stand, as if he were bored at the task of having to cross-examine him. He seemed in no hurry to proceed, but at the impatient movement of the judge, he finally said in a soft, lazy drawl, "I'm going to ask you to reconstruct the crime as you think it was committed, Ed." The witness blinked his eyes. He glanced inquiringly at the prosecuting attorney, upon whose face a sneer of contempt rode. The attorney nodded reassuringly. Arising, counsel for the defense crossed to his opponent's table and took from it the cowboy's lariat and the bronze bust of Beethoven. "With your permission," he drawled blandly to the prosecutor. Walking to the witness box, he placed the bust and lariat on the broad railing before the officer. Then he returned to his seat at the table. "Now then, Ed, show us how you think it was done," he said. Chapter 2. The witness ran his heavy fingers through his hair with a helpless sort of motion. He was painfully flustered, but pulling himself together, he rose, picked up the lariat, and uncoiled it. "Well, it was something like this, I think," he began vaguely. His embarrassment was painful. With a twist of his wrist, he threw the noose of the lariat over the head of the bronze bust and pulled the noose tight. "The window of his room," he said with a jerk of his head at the prisoner, "is 20 feet from the ground directly above the spot where I found his uncle's body. I figured that he dropped this bust on the old man's head from the window, then pulled the bust up with the lariat afterwards, like this." The witness let the 15-pound bronze drop over the railing of the witness box, then raised it again with the lariat and placed it once more on top of the railing. Counsel for the defense smiled approvingly. "Not bad for an amateur detective, Ed. That thing dropped 20 feet would cave a man's head in all right. What, may I ask, suggested this ingenious method to you?" Counsel's tone was pleasantly interrogative. There was no hint of ridicule in his voice. Nevertheless, the witness shot him a quick, suspicious glance. "When I examined his room, I found this lariat coiled on the bust," he explained, gaining confidence. "As there wasn't any window or door on the ground floor at that end of the house, from which he could have struck the blow that killed his uncle, nor any foot tracks in the snow except the old man's, I figured that this was the way he must have done it." "Very clever, Ed," the prisoner's attorney drawled. "Very." He stuck his thumbs into the armholes of his vest and surveyed the officer, head cocked to one side. "Let me see, Ed. You've been constable of Cardinal for nearly a year now, haven't you?" he asked. The witness nodded. "A year on the 25th of this month," he replied. "You'd like to be sheriff of Cardinal County, wouldn't you, Ed?" The witness looked about with a vague smile. "Well, yes, Colonel," he said. "Who wouldn't?" The attorney smiled back. "Your chances are pretty good now, Ed, ain't they?" he asked ungrammatically, but with the merest shade of emphasis upon the word now. "I suppose so. Everybody knows me. I was born and raised here," the witness replied with due modesty. The attorney nodded acquiescence. "I know, Ed. Your chances are particularly bright now, since you have so ably assisted the state in this prosecution, I mean." He was still smiling, but a sort of grating edge had crept into his drawl. A barely audible titter ran through the crowded courtroom. The prosecuting attorney was known to have political ambitions. A successful conviction of murder, the first murder in the county in 20 years, would count greatly for him in the coming election. This star witness who had aided him so ably was sure not to be forgotten by him. The witness moved uneasily. "I don't know about that, Colonel," he snapped with a sudden show of resentment. "I did my duty, that's all." The prosecutor was on his feet, his hard eyes flashing. "I object to the discrediting of the witness by personal and irrelevant observations," he stormed. "The officer is known to us as a reputable citizen." "There you go again, Warren," the defendant's counsel drawled querulously, "losing your temper over nothing." The judge frowned. He glanced from one to the other and sighed. Both men, prosecutor and defender, were his friends, outside the courtroom. The three of them had seen Cardinal grow from a collection of miners' tents to a city of some importance. He had proper respect for his profession, but he was not going to permit mere court routine to shatter a friendship of 30 years' standing. So he said in a tone of diplomatic deprecation to the defendant's counsel, "I'll have to sustain the objection, Colonel. Please proceed." Before the attorney for the state sat down, he said in a withering tone to his opponent, "If you don't lose your temper a dozen times before you're through, I'll miss my guess, Melvin Edgerly." "Gentlemen, you're in the court," the judge reminded them with some show of severity. The prisoner's counsel did not reply to the observation of his opponent. He glanced back at the dark-haired girl on the bench beside the prisoner, then turned to the witness again. "I was just trying to bring out, Ed, how sure you are that you're going to be our next sheriff." He jerked one stubby thumb over his shoulder at the girl. "If you had been half as sure of getting Laura there, there'd be wedding bells along with your inauguration, I guess." A wave of suppressed amusement passed through the crowd. The young constable's unsuccessful wooing of Laura Hamilton was common knowledge. Someone in one of the rear seats emitted a loud guffaw. The judge pounded his gavel. "Another such disturbance and I'll order the courtroom cleared," he thundered. The face of the witness burned a dull red. The girl on the bench beside the boy dropped her eyes. Her long, dark eyelashes lay like two crescents of jet against the clear pallor of her skin. The prisoner's hand stole out in protecting reassurance. His eyes were fastened upon the broad, untidy back of his attorney, as if he were trying to read there the motives responsible for the man's ill-timed digression. The counsel consulted his notes. "Were you alone in your office, Ed, on the morning of the 14th when the accused called up on the telephone and informed you that his uncle had been killed?" he asked after a pause. "I was," the witness snapped. "It was 8 o'clock when the telephone rang. I believe you stated before." "Yes." "You are sure about the time?" "Yes, sure." "Looked at your watch, I suppose?" "No, but I get down to the office at 7:45 every morning. I had been in only a short time when the telephone rang." "I see. You went directly to the place?" "Yes. I closed my desk and left at once." "I don't suppose you can tell us exactly to the minute when you arrived at the scene of the tragedy?" "I can. It was 10 minutes to 9, the officer asserted with snappy positiveness. "I looked at my watch as I walked across the field to the house." The attorney glanced at the ceiling. He seemed to be thinking. "The distance from your office in the city hall to the house is about 1 mile, he said. "Am I right?" "Yes, sir." "It took you from 8 o'clock to 10 minutes to 9, 50 minutes to cover the distance of 1 mile. The road was in a bad condition," the witness explained tersely. "It had been thawing heavily all night. I had to stop every little while to stamp the snow off my boots." "I see. If it hadn't been thawing so unusually hard all night, you could have made the distance in much less time. In, say, 25 minutes. 20 minutes easy, the witness corrected. I'm a fast walker. The colonel pursed his lips. He glanced at the judge, then transferred his gaze to the jury. When he spoke again, he seemed to be addressing no one in particular. The weather records show that it started thawing at 10:30 the night before. I guess the canyon road must have been in pretty bad shape, all right. It was the heaviest thaw on record for this time of the year, since 1912. He paused and leaned back in his chair and regarded the witness musingly. After you were taken charge of the body, he resumed, you looked around the house and found to your surprise that with the exception of your own foot tracks, there were no tracks leading to or from the house in any direction. That was what first directed your suspicion against my client, wasn't it? It was. It stopped snowing at 5 o'clock the night before. Here the constable pointed a heavy finger at the prisoner, told me that the last time he saw his uncle alive was at 10 o'clock the night before, when the old man was walking up and down outside the house, smoking. It did not snow after that, he added triumphantly. So you jumped to the conclusion that my client had murdered his uncle because there were no foot tracks in the snow. I didn't jump at nothing, the witness asserted with asperity. It was clear that the man who killed old Sergeant had never left the house, unless he came and went by aeroplane, he added with sarcasm. And then, being that my client was the only other occupant of the house, besides the dead man, the colonel went on imperturbably, you decided that he had killed his uncle and arrested him on the spot. On your own responsibility and without a warrant. Well, I wasn't going to give him a chance to make a getaway, the constable defended. Very thoughtful of you, Ed, the counsel drawled. That'll be all. Chapter 3. When the witness had resumed his post at the door, the colonel said, turning to the court, It has been pointed out by the prosecution that my client was Mr. Sargent's only heir, that an estate of something like $100,000 would come to him upon his uncle's death, that he is engaged to be married to a girl whom his uncle objected to strongly because of an old grudge against her father, which I think we are all familiar with, he added, with a glance about him. My client has admitted that the Mr. Sargent had forbidden him, under pains of disinheriting him, to even see the girl again. It has also been proven beyond a doubt that the two men quarreled a great deal of late, presumably over my client's choice of a wife. The prisoner and the girl exchanged glances of blank amazement. Even the prosecuting attorney moved restlessly in his chair. The judge frowned ponderously, and a murmur of disapproval passed over the spectators. The counsel for the defense was apparently throwing up his hands and convicting his client all over again instead of defending him, and he, the counsel alone, seemed oblivious of this fact. He paused briefly, then went on in his lazy drawl, Did it occur to the court that a man with as many good reasons for committing this murder as my client had would be a fool, nay, insane, to do so? He would automatically sign his own death warrant by such an act, and that if he was cunning enough to employ the method suggested by the prosecution, he would not possibly have overlooked the necessity of making a trail in the snow to and from the house. A trail would have been absolutely necessary to the success of his plan. By not doing so, would you have us believe that he deliberately planned that suspicion be directed toward him? It would have been an easy matter to have slipped on a pair of old shoes and have walked down to the road and back again and destroyed, or hidden the shoes afterwards. Even destroying the shoes would not have been necessary. The thaw would have enlarged the footprints to such an extent that identification would have been impossible. He paused and regarded the jury through half-closed lids. It has been established by the prosecution that my client is a man of ordinary intellect. Such a man would not possibly have overlooked the most vital part of his scheme. He might have overlooked some trifling detail, as the brainiest of criminals do at times. But that he should have forgotten to fake a set of tracks when the snow was there, as it were to order, for a perfect alibi, is utterly absurd. The attorney for the state arose. I object to generalities and far-fetched presumptions being used to discredit established facts, he insisted coldly. The colonel interrupted him. You have established no fact, if you please, Warren, except the fact that Mr. Sargent is dead. Anyone can assure himself of that by visiting the morgue. He turned to the court. I ask your honor to overrule the objection on the ground that the state is basing its conviction on circumstantial evidence, and that we of the defense are endeavoring to present the court with as strong a chain of circumstantial evidence for acquittal. What is sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander. The attorney for the state emitted a harsh laugh. The court frowned perplexedly. You're out of order, Colonel, the judge said. Still, I'll let it stand if you can show good reason for it. I will show good reason presently, counsel asserted mildly. He turned about in his chair and nodded to a very tall and very old man, seated, chair tip-tilted, a short distance to his right, directly under the witness stand. The man brought the front legs of his chair to the floor with a thump, arose and mounted the 3 steps to the witness box. He did not sit down, but remained standing, waiting to be sworn in. Even before the clerk had fully finished administering the oath to him, his clear yes rang out as a challenge upon the still courtroom. The attorney for the defense leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes for a moment, as if to select his words carefully before addressing the witness. Then he said, Dr. Shale, will you please show the court what you found when you performed the mortal examination upon Mr. Sargent? Without replying, the witness took from his pocket a leather wallet. Opening it, he took from it a small object, which he held up between his thumb and forefinger. This, he said briefly. Chapter 4. Necks were craned in his direction. The jurymen leaned forward in their seats, and the judge adjusted his spectacles. The prosecuting attorney stared at the object with a frown, half of annoyance, half of contempt, then transferred his gaze to the face of his opponent, who sat slumped in his chair, seemingly the least interested of anybody. The prisoner and the girl exchanged glances. The tension was broken by the colonel saying in his soft, crooning voice, Please tell the court where you found that pigeon's feather, Dr. Shale. I found it embedded in the dead man's brain 3 inches below the skull. That'll be all, Doctor. Thanks, counsel said. When the witness returned to his seat, he leaned over and laid the feather upon the table beside the prisoner's counsel. The colonel picked it up and placed it upon his blotter in plain sight of the court. The prosecuting attorney scowled at Dr. Shale. The coroner's verdict had been death from blow upon the head, cause unknown. He had refused point-blank to return an indictment for murder upon the evidence submitted, so Attorney Warren had gone ahead on his own account. Pigeon's feather, he scoffed. Nothing of the sort. Swallow's feather, that's what it is. I beg your pardon? There was irritation in the colonel's voice for the first time. It's a pigeon's feather. The jurymen looked at one another. Most of them knew a pigeon's feather when they saw one, and all of them were positive that the object on the colonel's blotter, a slim steel blue feather, was not a pigeon's. A cynical smile played about the corners of the prosecutor's thin lips. If you expect to win this case on ornithological decisions, you'd better take a week off and study up on the subject, Melvin Edgerly, he sneered. I'll stake my reputation, legal and otherwise, that the feather on your blotter is a swallow's feather. I think I know what I'm talking about. I didn't get my degree in ornithology at Stanford for nothing. That's so, the colonel admitted suddenly. I remember now, you used to be bugs on birds' nests and eggs and things when you were a kid, Warren. It was my hobby, if that's what you mean, the prosecutor replied stiffly. The colonel might have observed here that robbing the nests of inoffensive songsters for the purpose of studying them was more of a cruelty than a hobby, but he forbore. Instead, he leaned forward in his chair and, fastening his china blue eyes on the prosecutor's face, said calmly, For the purpose of securing expert testimony on a question of ornithology, I hereby subpoena you, Robert Warren, as a witness for the defense. Take the stand, please." The prosecutor's jaw dropped. "What?" He looked about him appealingly at this unheard-of procedure. "It's unethical, I know, Warren." The colonel sighed deprecatingly. "But I'm within my rights." He turned to the judge. "How about it, Your Honor?" he asked. "I suppose so, Colonel," the judge replied helplessly. But, he ended lamely, "I won't be made a monkey of before the court." The prosecutor stormed, shaking his fist at the colonel. "I refuse." "Gentlemen," the judge admonished. He turned to the outraged attorney. "Better take the stand, Warren, before I'm forced to fine you for contempt of court." "All right," the attorney snapped, subsiding. He stalked to the witness chair, suffered himself to be sworn in, then shot his opponent a baleful glance. The colonel looked up blandly and handed him the feather. "Please tell the court in your own terms, scientific terms if you wish, how you know that this is a swallow's feather." The witness cleared his throat and pulled himself together. For 3 minutes steady, he explained to the court how he knew that the feather in his hand was a swallow's feather. Warming up to his subject, he forgot momentarily his anger at his opponent's unethical conduct. He went into details about the differences between the feathers of birds of prey and those of songbirds, and the comparative wing power of the different species. He even touched upon the subject of protective coloration. When he was through, there was not a man in the courtroom who doubted for a moment that the feather in his hand was a swallow's feather, and when the prisoner's attorney excused him, he went back to his table, conscious of having won another victory over the defense. He replaced the feather upon his own table beside the bronze bust and sat down. A smile rode across his heavy jowl. A verdict of guilty seemed a foregone conclusion now. By his rambling digressions, the prisoner's counsel had strengthened the case of the state instead of weakening it. And now, the counsel seemed to realize it for the first time. He sat slumped back in his chair, with his stubby fingers interlocked across his loose-fitting vest, his putty-like face sunk deep in apparent gloom. Only his china-blue eyes were alert. Those who sat near him noted the odd veiled look that had crept into them. "Please proceed, Colonel." The judge's voice roused him to action. Running his hand into his pocket, he pulled out an old thumb-marked notebook, opened it, and took from it a feather identical with the one on the prosecutor's table. Leaning over, he laid the second feather beside the first one. "I took this one from a swallow's nest under the eaves of Sergeant's house just above my client's window," he said in a flat, colorless tone, as if it concerned no one. The jurymen looked at one another, then at their foreman. They sensed that something momentous was about to be presented to them. The colonel glanced their way, but not at them. He seemed to be regarding some point above their heads, beyond them. Upon one of the wooden brackets supporting the eaves, I found a deep gouge, torn out of the soft redwood by some hard object striking it. His voice rose to a slightly sharper pitch as he went on. "The bracket is 2 feet above my client's window and 4 feet below the lowest point of the eaves." Arising, he walked to the window near the judge's bench, opened it, and ran down the upper sash. The window was in direct line of vision of the juryman. Pulling an old-fashioned Colt's .45 from his pocket, he raised the pistol and fired it upward through the half-open sash. The entire courtroom was on its feet before the report had died away. The judge towered menacingly above the man who had dared to disturb the tranquility of his court in such an unheard-of manner. His eyes were flashing, but they grew wide with amazement when a heavy, transparent object shot by the window and struck the cement pavement outside, with a report louder than the discharge of the pistol. Judge, prosecutor, and jury crowded about the window and looked out. Upon the sidewalk under the window lay the shattered remains of a huge icicle. The counsel for the defense was speaking. His voice was no longer flat, nor colorless, nor even drawling. The feather which my learned colleague so obligingly and correctly classified as a swallow's feather became frozen to the point of a giant icicle that dropped from the eaves near the swallow's nest and struck old Sergeant on the head, killing him instantly. The icicle in its downward course struck the redwood bracket, hence the gouge in the wood. The feather was driven 3 inches into Sergeant's head by the force of the impact. The strong thaw which dislodged the icicle melted it away by morning, thus obliterating completely the weapon, if I may term it a weapon, by which Mr. Sergeant met his death. I asked the court to instruct the jury for acquittal. The jurymen glanced at one another and nodded. "I don't think it'll be necessary," the foreman said. "Still, as a matter of routine, I suppose," he smiled. "You win, Colonel." End of The Weight of a Feather by Clausen. The Vault by Leinster. Chapter 1. The window slid up easily, too easily, and Mike waited a long time, listening before he made a move. The whole huge pile of the factory was still. There were no lights anywhere, except that dim one by the gate through the stockade. Lying quite still in the darkness, Mike waited. There was no sound, no ringing of alarm bells, no bustle of activity anywhere. The manufacturing plant of the Whitney Jewelry and Watch Company remained as it had been before, a vast, still pile of brick, with empty-eyed windows staring blankly at the night. And yet, that window had opened very easily. Mike meditated, his little eyes gleaming in the darkness. Then he saw a tiny flicker of light in the distance. The window he had opened was at the end of a long corridor, and he saw the watchman walking unhurriedly away from him. The watchman's legs threw monstrous shadows from the lantern he carried. Mike could not see his face, but he could see the uniform and note the absolute leisure and confidence with which the man was moving. He paused, as Mike watched, and inserted his key in a watchman's clock. He turned it, registering his presence and vigilance on a strip of paper within the mechanism. Then casually he went on his way. In a few moments he turned a corner and was lost to sight. Mike grinned to himself in the obscurity. With monkey-like agility, he scrambled through the open window, making no sound. Once within the walls of the factory, he waited another long minute for a noise. Distant and hollow, he heard the watchman's footfalls, unhurried, methodical, as he made his round. Then, softly, Mike lowered the window. He wore rubber-soled shoes. His eyes were those of a cat, and his ears were attuned to the slightest warning of danger. But he heard no faintest sound, not even his own footfalls, save the distant, regular steps of the watchman. The watchman wore creaky shoes. Like some night-flying moth, the intruder slipped through the corridors of the untenanted factory. All about him there were smells. Oil, that would be the delicate lathes where precious metals were worked. Once he smelled fresh paint, and there was that curious odor of freshly mopped floors. The scrub women had come after the closing of the factory and done their work. Then he smelled faded flowers. Someone had brought them and put them in a glass of water, and they had been left. Mike paid little or no attention to smells. The place he sought was on the 2nd floor, in the rear, the colossal vault where all the precious things in which the factory dealt were gathered for safety during the night. He made his way there silently. Every little while he stopped to listen for the unvarying footfalls of the watchman. They went on, unsuspicious and confident. Through an arduous and twice interrupted apprenticeship in his chosen trade, interruptions spent perforce behind stone walls, Mike had drilled into him just 2 things. One was the fatality of haste. The other was the necessity for scientific, painstaking attention to detail. Therefore, Mike let his flashlight slip over the huge surface of the vault door with barely a pause. He knew the watchman would look in on it as he went downstairs. Primarily, he was looking for a place to hide during that moment. There was a door in the room which contained the vault, but Mike was not certain but that the watchman would return through it. He swept his light around the room, keeping it low, lest it flash out through a window, and regretfully decided against remaining. He went out again, swiftly and silently, looking for a hiding place. He found it in a washroom, and listened from there while the watchman retraced his steps, coming downstairs again. Going to the vault and throwing the glow from his lantern against it, then clumping off heavily to the lower part of the factory. Mike emerged from hiding. He inspected the vault room with greater care. He would have to work in snatches between visits from the watchman, and he did not want to have to tap the man on the head. There are a great many systems of burglar protection, and one very popular one signals the nearest police station when a watchman fails to ring his time clock at the appointed intervals. Mike did not desire the intrusion of the police, but he wanted a nearby niche to hide in. The watchman's footsteps died away. Mike waited to be sure, then opened the door he had noted. To be exact, he did not quite open it. He merely turned the knob, and a heavy weight leaning against it thrust it the rest of the way open, caromed clumsily against him, and fell with a curiously cushioned crash to the floor. Mike's hair stood on end. In the fractional part of a split second he knew what had struck him, and he bounced into the air to alight noiselessly a full 5 feet away, ready for anything. But the thing lay still upon the floor, breathing. Slowly and cautiously Mike sent a momentary dart of light at it. What he saw at once reassured him and frightened him because it was the last thing he could possibly have expected. It was a man, which he had known, but it was a man with his hands and feet bound together with leather straps, and so entwined with ropes that he could not even writhe. There was a gag in the figure's mouth, and its eyes were staring wildly about. Mike was still for perhaps 2 seconds while his brain raced. Then he sent a tiny pencil beam at the vault door. It was closed solidly. No one had been before him. But there was a man bound hand and foot. The light played upon him again. He was a young man, dressed as if he were a clerk or a bookkeeper in the factory. His eyes blinked and stared imploringly at Mike. There was some message, some terrible message, that he struggled to convey, but the gag prevented him. Mike watched him for an instant in mounting uneasiness and suspicion. That window had slipped up too easily. Suddenly there was a tiny creaking, as of a board stepped upon. Mike heard it, catalogued it, and had dismissed his obvious refuge in an instant. Someone was coming, softly, toward the spot. Perhaps the watchman, alarmed by the crash. He would certainly find the bound man, but it might be that he would waste precious time releasing him. Tensely, Mike swept the walls again. He could not go out the main door. He would run into the watchman. The one door he had noted was that of a closet. There was another, close beside the back of the vault. Dense blackness fell. A shadow but little deeper than the darkness about him, Mike flitted across the room. He vanished, utterly without sound. Then a faint scratching sound. The bound man was struggling to release himself, struggling with a terrible desperation and a horrifying futility. Mike, crouched down in a tiny book closet, heard it. He was keyed up to an incredible pitch, every nerve quivering like a tightly strung wire. Mike was no longer intent upon robbery. One of the first rules of your old-time safe cracker is to go through with a job only when everything is right. Mike was as suspicious of the unexpected as any wild animal. Just now his only desire was to get away, peacefully if possible, but to get away. He lay still. The scent of books and dust came to his nostrils, but he did not dare make a light to see. He smelled, too, that curious rubbery smell of new electric insulation. There were wires in the closet somewhere, newly placed. Mike lay still. Then he felt, rather than heard, someone enter the vault room. There was a door between him and the newcomer, but he knew the instant that the other man entered. There was a moment of silence. Mike saw an infinitely faint glow through the keyhole. Someone was using a flash. Chapter 2. Frozen in utter stillness, Mike listened for the watchman's exclamation of astonishment at sight of the bound man on the floor. Instead, he heard only a faint murmur. Then he caught words, faintly amused. "Just got out, Jack, eh? I heard you fall." Out of luck, though. The watchman was in the other building. I saw him go in. He didn't hear you. Then little noises as if the helpless man were being turned over, inspected to make sure the bonds were firmly in place. Then Mike felt that the last coma was somewhat relieved. "Don't know how you got loose, Jack," said the voice, as before kept lowered, "but you didn't do any harm anyhow. And the watchman won't be back for an hour yet. I'll be getting to work." There was a sound like a groan, as if the bound man were trying to make some sound or plea, but footsteps crossed lightly to the vault. "Wondering, Jack, who I am, or did you recognize me?" The second man had stopped before the vault door. Mike heard an infinitely faint rustling, as of thin rubber being manipulated. He guessed at rubber gloves. "I think you must have recognized me when I slugged you. Anyway, since I asked you to wait a minute after office hours and then hit you with a sandbag, you must have guessed, while you've been waiting, that I was responsible for the matter." There was a little pause and a slight snapping sound, as if an elastic had been flicked into place. "Yep, Jack. I'm Saunders, your boss. Don't mind telling you now, because you're not going to split on me. I'm going to loot the same, clean this time, and quit. By the way, Jack, I'm putting on rubber gloves, but rather curiously, they'll leave your fingerprints on the safe knob. You see, I've done this twice before. Once I got away with a lot of bullion and a few indifferent stones. That was a year and more ago, and everyone's grown careless since then. I managed to plant it so the watchman was suspected. He's in jail now. And then, once, I fixed up the matter so that a theft of some finished stuff was discovered while I was on vacation. They never suspected me. But this time I'm going to clean out the works. All the bullion, all the stones, and tomorrow's payroll." The unknown's voice changed and grew intent. Mike, in the dusty little closet, could hear a muted, musical tinkle as he spun the combination knob. "Got your fingerprints some time ago, Jack, when you knew nothing about it. I brought them out, photographed them, and contrived to fix them on the ends of these rubber gloves. I've run them through my hair so they'll be slightly oily, and they'll convict you completely of opening the safe. I'll have to use a microphone myself to hear the tumblers fall." Mike was listening with a curious mixture of fear, indignation, and curiosity. He himself had a microphone apparatus in his pocket, which he had intended to use. The other man had beaten him to it. Mike began to revolve a misty scheme for following the other man and taking his loot away. There was a clanking as of tiny bits of metal being fitted together. "I rather think, Jack," the voice became amused, "that you're thinking of the trap that's fixed for any man who breaks into the safe, aren't you?" A moment of silence. "So that even if someone gets inside the vault, when he touches one of several things, he'll set off a switch, have the doors swing shut and lock on him, and ring a loud bell in police headquarters? I suggested that, Jack, and I was the one who was strong for the bell. I told him a burglar would be smothered in here in 2 hours, but with the doors closing fast on him to catch him, the police could get here. Let him out and save his life, and catch him with the goods. But you forget there's a switch to run that burglar trap on." Mike, listening, found himself suddenly cold all over. If he had opened the huge vault, as he was confident he could do, he would never have thought of anything like that. He would have gone in, only anxious to secure his loot and depart before the watchman's return. With luck, he would have been able, he thought, to get the big doors closed, so his burglary would have gone unnoticed until morning. But when he went in, he would have touched one of a number of concealed springs. The huge doors would have swung to relentlessly upon him. He would have been trapped in an airtight tomb, to batter futilely at the armor plate barriers until the police came. He was to get another shock. "This afternoon, though," said the soft voice outside, interrupted now and then by the infinitely faint musical sound of the spinning knobs, "I did a little work on that wiring. The doors will work, but the alarm won't. The police will not be notified that a burglar is caught in the vault." Sweat came out, cold and clammy, on Mike's skin. He would have been caught in there. He would have strangled. Hunched upon the floor of the smelly little book closet, he shivered in uncontrollable terror from sheer horror at what he had escaped. Again he longed to get away from the factory, at any cost. "Most through," said the abstracted voice outside. "Wonder why I'm telling you, Jack. You see, I need the stuff in there. Need it in my business. I'm going to take it, but I don't want to have detectives chasing around to try to find the thief. With your fingerprints on the knob, they'd look for you, of course, but you might have proved an alibi to make 'em look farther. And also, Jack, you're too damned fascinating. I was getting along pretty well with Ethel until she met you. I want to get you out of the way. With you dead, she'll marry me sooner or later. I'm going to tap you on the head again, Jack, and put you in here. The doors will close on you. In the morning they'll find that you opened the vault, passed out quite a lot of stuff to a Confederate, and then by accident touched off the alarm that closes the doors. A sandbag doesn't leave any sign, and I use straps to tie you up so there'll be no marks on your wrists. I've thought of pretty nearly everything, Jack. I've even taken out all the pencils and fountain pens from your pockets. I've no notion of your writing an accusation of me while you're in there. Also, I don't want to kill you before you go in there. I want you to show the signs of dying from, the natural cause of being locked in an airtight vault." Ah. There was a series of tiny clicks, then a faint creaking. Mike, in his hiding place, with the smell of dust and books and newly placed rubber insulation in his nostrils, knew that the great doors had swung open. There was a pause and the little snap of a watch case. "Watchman's due in half an hour, plenty of time." The voice stopped. The man seemed to be listening. That was what Mike would have done. He lay utterly and completely motionless, barely breathing. He was queerly afraid of the man he had not seen. Perhaps because of that, Mike felt a sudden cramp in one of his legs, a sharp, tingling, shooting pain. He could not run on a leg like that. It might give way beneath him. "All clear," said the voice with a certain ghastly cheerfulness. "But in case you're thinking that I might set off the trap, Jack, I'd like to mention that after I had you neatly trussed up, I pulled out the switch. It's in that little closet back there. I shall turn it on after I've got the stuff out, and then the doors will close on you. But first I'll tap you on the head and put you inside." Mike shivered. The smell of insulation. The switch was in the closet in which he was hiding. In a little while more the unknown would come in where he was. Sheer panic came over Mike. It was with a terrific effort that he calmed himself, trying to figure out an escape from the inevitable struggle. The other man would open the door. He, Mike, was inside. At best there would be a struggle, at worst. Chapter 3. Mike's whole body was bathed in sweat at the thought of himself thrown inside the vault, with armor-plated doors inexorably shutting out every atom of fresh air. He clenched his teeth to keep them from chattering. The man outside took on the aspect of a monster. To Mike, he was something more or less than human. Mike might be a criminal and could visualize the thought of killing a man and making a getaway, but not the deliberate strangling of a man in cold blood for the covering of his tracks. That was the other man's plan. There would have to be a struggle, a fight of some sort. Mike's leg throbbed horribly. He doubted that it would support his weight, and in an instant or two more he would inevitably be fighting. One way or another, he was bound to be in terrible danger. If he shot the other man, the pistol shot would raise an alarm. If he did not shoot, He heard a faint thump on the floor. "One load," said the voice outside. "2 or 3 more, Jack, and I'll skip." The voice, already soft, became muffled as its owner went into the vault. "Here's the payroll. Nice packet in itself. I've a good 20 minutes left. You realize what will happen, Jack? I loot the vault, tap you on the head, take off your bonds, and put you in here. Then I push on the switch, the doors close on you, and I get away with the stuff. In the morning they'll find you inside and the stuff gone. Your fingerprints will be on the knobs. Inference will inevitably be that the trap got you as you were handing out the stuff to a Confederate. Pretty scheme, isn't it, Jack?" The man seemed to be gloating a little over the agony of his prospective victim. Mike, struggling to massage his leg into some semblance of life, and to make no noise in doing so, heard the infinitely faint sound of the bound man struggling upon the floor. He made a curious moan, utterly despairing. "Just one more trip, Jack," said the voice, filled with a terrifying amusement. "Then I'll come back for you." Mike's throat was dry. He feared that man he had not seen, feared him with the ultimate of terror. And in a moment or two more he would have to fight him, struggle with him. Cold to the marrow, dry-lipped with fear, his little eyes staring, Mike started to raise himself to his feet as he heard the other man enter the vault. His leg was numb. It would barely hold his weight up. Mike's teeth began to chatter. He heard the man rummaging about inside the steel tomb. And then Mike felt a sudden agonizing pain in his back. Something jabbed cruelly into his backbone, hurting horribly. And then, with a spitting flash of bluish light, the pain ceased. But outside, there was a sudden rumbling and a cushioned crash. Then a distant, muffled scream, barely audible. Glassy-eyed with terror, Mike flung open the door to run. He saw a small electric lantern upon the floor, its beam directed at the 2 huge doors of the vault. And they were closed. In the fraction of an instant, Mike knew what had happened. Rising in the closet, he had jammed his back into the knife switch that turned on the current for the burglar trap. It had closed the doors, imprisoning the unknown Saunders in the airtight vault. And he, the imprisoned man, had cut the wires that would have warned the police of his predicament. Uttering a little gasp that was compounded of horror and fear, Mike started forward, only to have his numbed leg give way beneath him. The fall sobered him to a curious, fictitious calmness. He flashed his lamp on the bound, still figure. Its eyes were closed. The face was utterly white. "Fainted," said Mike to himself shakily. "Safe enough, though." He suddenly scrambled to his feet again and ran. Through the dark hallways and down the steps he fled. He was possessed by an unreasoning terror. The window through which he had entered was open. Evidently the other man had arranged it for his own ingress. Mike fairly fell outside, and suddenly was in complete possession of himself again. With the quiet dark night all around him he felt secure, and he abruptly became conscious that he was carrying something in one hand. He had picked it up when his leg gave way. He let a faint ray trickle through his fingers upon it. Then he grinned uncertainly. Evidently he had happened upon a portion of the payroll. He saw yellow backs at any rate, with the bills in the bundle he held. "My God," said Mike unevenly. "That was a shock. There have been shocks all around tonight. That fella in the vault, and the fella that fainted." "Say," a thought struck him, "wonder if he'll come out of that faint in time to tell about a fella being in the vault. My God. Maybe he don't know." He looked back through the window he had left, his breath coming hurriedly, uneasily. He saw a faint glow a long distance away. The watchman was making his rounds again. Mike saw the confident, assured steps of the man by the light of his lantern. His legs threw monstrous shadows on the walls. He went on his way unhurriedly, reached a time clock, and extracted a key. He inserted and turned it, registering his presence and vigilance upon a strip of paper inside the mechanism. Then, casually, he went on his way. "Brother," Mike apostrophized the unconscious figure, "I just had a shock. 2 other fellas had their shocks. And now, all top, you're in for yours." Here's hoping the watchman turned a corner and was lost to sight, but his steady, even footsteps came dully to Mike's ears. He was climbing the stairs, and he wore squeaky shoes. Mike slipped quickly and quietly away. End of The Vault by Murray Leinster. The Fingerprint Bureau by J.H. Taylor. Beginning with this issue, the fingerprint department will be conducted by Mr. J.H. Taylor. Mr. Taylor is Superintendent, Bureau of Identification, Department of Navigation of the Navy Department. Readers desiring information or advice on subjects relating to fingerprints may communicate with Mr. Taylor in care of the Black Mask magazine. There is no charge for this service. Mr. Taylor requests, however, that letters requiring replies be accompanied by a stamped, addressed envelope. Letters of general interest, together with their answers, will be printed in each issue. Ever since the world began, someone has endeavored to find 2 things that are exactly alike. But from a scientific point of view, this has never been accomplished. The leaves on the trees resemble each other so closely that it is extremely difficult for anyone not experienced in botany to detect the difference. An experienced botanist can at a glance see that there is no resemblance whatever. The closest resemblance ever found in the world is believed to have been between twins. Their facial expression is in a great many cases as near alike as it is possible to be. Even their mannerisms, likes and dislikes are the same, and if these twins are dressed alike, it is practically impossible to tell one from the other. It is a well-known fact in the case of the mother of the twins, who could not tell one from the other, that she washed one baby twice and did not wash the other, as she said that it was impossible for her to tell which was which when they were undressed, their physical appearance being so near alike. The reason for twins resembling each other so closely has been thoroughly explained in several magazine articles, and it is claimed that identical twins spring from a single germ which is fertile and breaks, thereby producing twins, and it can be clearly understood why the disposition and facial expressions of these children would be exactly alike. But God, in His wonderful workings, has made it possible for the scientific world to differentiate these twins by the lines on the soles of the feet, the palms of the hands, and the fingertips. In identical twins, it is known to those who have had occasion to examine the impressions of the feet that the patterns of the right foot of a twin will be very similar to the patterns on the right foot of the other twin. This has confused a great many people, and they are of the opinion that twins are identical in every way, but when the minute ridge characteristics in the fingerprints and the soles of the feet are examined, to the fingerprint expert, it is easily shown that there is no more resemblance between the twins than there is between people of different parentage. Of all the people in the world since the year 400 BC, there have never been found 2 individuals who have had the same fingerprints or footprints. Photographs and descriptions have been found very misleading to the various police departments throughout the country, and at times they have caused very serious mistakes in identity. As it is a well-known fact that there are a great many people who, though they are not related, have practically the same facial expression, walk, or mannerisms, and by a person not experienced in identification, the persons would to all intents and purposes be pronounced the same. In identification work in the Army, Navy, and Marine Corps, where they have to deal with thousands of men every year, no other system that has ever been invented would answer the purpose other than the fingerprint system. As by this system, no matter whether they are identical twins or their facial expressions are identically the same, they are known by their fingerprints, and there can never be any mistake as to their identity. Identical twins are those who resemble each other the most, and unless some system had been devised, such as the fingerprint system, there would never have been any way of differentiating twins or people who closely resembled one another. In the case of criminals and fugitives from justice, these men will resort to every possible method to change their general appearance, such as using chemicals to change the color of their hair, and will also at times use pneumatic suits in order to change their appearance from slender to stout. But with all of these disguises, there has never been found any plan by which they can change their fingerprints, and their identity is forever known once their fingerprints have been taken. Anyone who has had occasion to examine the photographs of a given individual taken at different periods of life will see the most marked changes in each photograph, and a novice would be unable to state whether or not they were taken of the same person. The resemblance in photographs has been so close that some of the foremost Bertillon operators in this country have been baffled. In the case of two Negroes in the Leavenworth Penitentiary, both under the name of William West, their facial expressions and measurements were so much alike that the Bertillon operator could not state positively by their photographs that they were different individuals, but their fingerprints showed them to be entirely different. In the Navy, there have been any number of twins who have enlisted, and the only possible way they could have been told apart was by their fingerprints, as when they are placed in uniforms of the same rating, their general appearance is more marked and harder to tell apart than when in civilian clothes. The fingerprints of the human race are divided into 4 general types, and these impressions will be found in the fingers of everyone. But the ridge characteristics which determine identity have never been known to appear in the same place in a different person's fingers. The possibility of a ridge characteristic appearing in the same place in 2 different persons' fingers is 1 in a million. And a great many of the courts throughout the United States have accepted 7 ridge characteristics appearing in the same place in 2 impressions as positive proof of identity. By this method, there is no possibility of a person losing his identity if his fingerprints have ever been recorded, regardless of how closely he might resemble someone else. Fingerprint patterns. Part 3. Whorls. Last month, you were told that the whorl pattern would be explained to you. The accompanying illustration shows 2 whorls. A whorl is a pattern in which the ridges make a complete turn about one central point. You can distinguish a whorl by the fact that it has 2 deltas, while a loop has but 1 delta. A delta is the outer terminus of a pattern, the point from which we start to count ridges. It is called a delta because it usually resembles the Greek letter delta or a small triangle. Maybe you have a whorl pattern on one of your fingers. Study them closely and see if you can find any whorls. End of the Fingerprint Bureau by J. H. Taylor.